Sometimes the most important response isn't a reply, an explanation, or a reaction. It's silence. Not the kind that's cold or bitter, but the kind that comes from clarity. When you stop saying everything you feel and start letting your absence speak, something shifts. You don't argue with his ego anymore. You let it do the work on its own. Silence is often misunderstood as avoidance, weakness, but in reality, it can be one of the clearest expressions of self-respect. When you've already communicated your needs, your boundaries, or your expectations and nothing has changed, continuing to speak doesn't create clarity, it creates noise. At that point, silence isn't about running away from a conversation, it's about recognizing that the conversation has already happened, even if it wasn't honored. Many people stay in cycles of explaining because they believe being understood will finally lead to change. They carefully choose their words, soften their tone, and revisit the same points again and again, hoping that this time it will land differently. But when someone consistently fails to meet you where you are, more explanation only reinforces a pattern where your needs are acknowledged but not prioritized. Silence breaks that pattern by removing the constant narration of your inner world. Choosing silence requires a clear internal decision. It's not passive waiting or emotional withdrawal meant to provoke guilt. It's a calm acknowledgement that you've said what needed to be said, and now your energy is better spent elsewhere. This kind of silence is grounded, not reactive. It comes from clarity rather than confusion, from self-trust rather than fear. There's also a deep emotional maturity in knowing when words no longer serve you. Not every situation improves with more dialogue. Some situations improve only when behavior changes, and silence allows you to observe that behavior without interference. When you stop explaining, you give reality the space to reveal itself. You're no longer cushioning the truth with patience or hope. You're letting it stand on its own. Silence also protects you from overexposure. When emotions run high, it's easy to overshare, justify, or say things you later wish you'd held back. By saying nothing, you preserve your dignity and prevent your vulnerability from being mishandled. You keep your power not by withholding affection, but by honoring your own emotional boundaries. This clarity doesn't mean you stop caring or become indifferent. It means you stop trying to manage someone else's understanding. You release the responsibility of making them see your worth or your perspective. That release is freeing. It allows you to redirect your attention to your own well-being rather than constantly monitoring how your words are received. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes a form of self-alignment. Your inner values and your outward behavior finally match. You no longer say one thing while tolerating another. You no longer ask for what you're unwilling to walk away from. In that alignment, there's a quiet confidence that doesn't need validation. And while his ego may begin to fill the silence with its own assumptions or questions, that's not your concern. The purpose of saying nothing isn't to create discomfort, it's to create peace. When you stop speaking from a place of unmet needs and start acting from a place of self-respect, silence stops being empty. It becomes intentional, grounded, and unmistakably clear. The ego is remarkably skilled at defending itself against emotion. It knows how to dismiss tears as overreaction, label concerns as insecurity, or reinterpret heartfelt conversations in ways that preserve its sense of control. When you explain yourself repeatedly, you may feel honest and vulnerable, but to an unready ego, those explanations often become background noise. They are heard, perhaps even acknowledged, yet rarely acted upon. That's because explanation still offers connection, reassurance, and continued access. Absence works differently. When you stop explaining, you remove the emotional feedback loop the ego relies on. There's no longer a stream of words to reinterpret, no feelings to debate, no tone to critique. The silence creates a vacuum, and ego struggles in vacuums. Without your voice shaping the narrative, the mind begins to fill in the gaps on its own. Questions surface that no explanation ever forced. Why did she stop? What changed? What did I miss? Emotion invites defense. Absence invites reflection. When you express frustration or hurt, the ego can respond by justifying behavior or minimizing impact. But when you step back quietly, there's nothing to push against. The absence of your presence becomes the message, and that message can't be argued with. It simply exists. What makes absence so strong is that it removes the illusion of control. As long as you're explaining, responding, and engaging, the ego feels anchored. It knows where it stands. But when access is removed without drama, certainty disappears. The ego no longer knows how it's perceived, and that uncertainty can be deeply unsettling. It forces introspection, not because you demanded it, but because there's no longer anything external to lean on. This doesn't mean absence should be used as a tactic to provoke anxiety or chase validation. If silence is performative or resentful, it loses its grounding. The power of absence comes from its authenticity, from genuinely choosing to disengage because you value your peace. When your withdrawal is real, not strategic, it carries a different energy. It's steady, not tense, calm, not charged. People don't realize how much they relied on your emotional availability until it's gone. Your explanations, check-ins, and emotional openness provided reassurance, even if they didn't reciprocate it. When that disappears, the ego notices the gap. And in that gap, there's space for self-questioning that emotional conversations never created. Whether or not reflection leads to change is beyond your control. Absence doesn't guarantee accountability or growth in the other person. But it guarantees something important for you, freedom from over-explaining your worth. You're no longer investing energy in convincing someone to understand you. You're trusting that your value doesn't need constant articulation. Absence isn't a punishment, it's a release. It releases you from the exhausting role of emotional translator, and if his ego begins to unravel in the silence, that's simply a byproduct of losing access to something it once took for granted. When you stop responding, it can feel uncomfortable at first, as though you're leaving something unfinished or creating confusion. But in reality, silence doesn't create uncertainty. It exposes what was already there. So much of a connection's momentum is maintained by one person filling the gaps, initiating conversations, smoothing over awkwardness, responding quickly, and keeping emotional continuity alive. When that effort stops, the true structure of the dynamic becomes visible. Many people mistake constant communication for mutual interest. They assume that because messages are exchanged and time passes, something meaningful is being built. But when you pause and say nothing, you begin to see whether the connection stands on its own or was being propped up by your consistency. If the other person steps forward, initiates, and shows up with clarity, that tells you something. If nothing happens, that silence tells you something just as important. Silence removes the buffer that politeness and habit often provide. When you keep responding out of courtesy or hope, you can unintentionally mask a lack of effort on the other side. Saying nothing gives behavior room to speak honestly. Strips away potential, promises, and assumptions, leaving only action or the absence of it. What's powerful about this moment is that you're no longer guessing. You're no longer interpreting mixed signals or trying to read between the lines. Silence simplifies the equation. You see clearly whether someone values connection enough to reach for it without being prompted. And that clarity is a gift, even when the answer isn't what you hoped for. This doesn't mean you're testing. You're not withholding communication to see what happens. You're stepping back because you're done carrying the weight alone. There's a difference between intentional silence and emotional withdrawal. Intentional silence is calm and observant. It's rooted in self-respect, not fear of rejection. People discover through silence that they were more invested in the idea of the connection than in the reality of it. When no effort appears, it forces an honest reckoning. You realize how much energy you were contributing and how little was coming back. That awareness can be painful, but it's also freeing. It allows you to stop chasing clarity and start accepting truth. If the other person does respond, their approach often changes. Without the safety net of your constant availability, they have to decide whether to show up with intention or let the connection fade. Either outcome gives you information you can trust, because it wasn't influenced by pressure, reminders, or emotional appeals. Silence also shifts your focus inward. Instead of waiting for messages or analyzing responses, you begin to reclaim mental space. You notice how much time and energy you were spending maintaining something that may not have been balanced. In that space, your priorities realign. You start valuing reciprocity more than reassurance. When you say nothing, the dynamic reveals itself not because silence is powerful on its own, but because it removes the noise that was hiding the truth. And once you see that truth clearly, you no longer need to ask what to do next. The answer becomes obvious. Power struggles thrive on engagement. They need reactions, defenses, explanations, and emotional energy to stay alive. When two people are locked in cycles of arguing, justifying, or trying to be understood, the focus quietly shifts from connection to control. Each response becomes an attempt to win, to be right, or to protect pride. And in those moments, even vulnerability can turn into a performance for the ego. Silence changes the terrain completely. When you stop engaging, the struggle loses its fuel. You're no longer trying to convince, correct, or defend yourself. You step out of the arena altogether. This isn't surrender, it's refusal. Refusal to keep participating in a dynamic that drains you and leads nowhere. Arguments often create the illusion of progress. Words are exchanged, emotions are aired, and for a moment it feels like something meaningful happened. But if the same patterns repeat, those conversations weren't breakthroughs. They were loops. Silence interrupts the loop. It removes the push and pull that keeps both people emotionally tethered, even when nothing is actually changing. What makes calm silence so disarming is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no final statement, no declaration of distance, no emotional closing speech. You simply stop responding in the ways you used to. That quiet shift removes the opposition the ego needs to perform. Without resistance, there's nothing to dominate, nothing to dismiss, and nothing to push against. This is where power quietly returns to you. Power doesn't come from being louder, more persuasive, or more emotionally expressive. It comes from no longer needing to engage in a fight you didn't start and can't win. When you're no longer invested in proving your point, the other person loses the leverage that came from your reaction. Silence also protects your emotional integrity. In power struggles, people often say things they don't fully mean just to regain control or defend themselves. By choosing not to engage, you avoid compromising your values or speaking from a place of frustration. You preserve your self-respect by staying aligned with who you want to be, even when the situation invites you to react. The absence of conflict can be unsettling. Without the familiar back and forth, they're left alone with their thoughts. The ego can't measure itself against your reactions anymore. And while that discomfort isn't your goal, it's a natural result of removing yourself from a dynamic that was built on tension. Silence shifts your focus away from winning and back toward peace. When there's no argument to prepare for, your nervous system settles. You regain clarity. You begin to see the situation without the emotional fog that constant engagement creates. From that place, decisions become simpler and more grounded. Stepping out of a power struggle doesn't mean you've lost. It means you've recognized that real power lies in not needing to fight at all. And when you choose silence from that place of calm, you don't just end the struggle, you end its hold over you. There is a quiet strength in knowing when not to explain yourself. When someone has already shown you, through their actions, how much space they are willing to give you in their life, repeating your feelings can slowly chip away at your dignity. Each additional explanation risks turning your needs into something that feels negotiable, or worse, something that needs approval. Saying nothing at that point is not emotional withdrawal, it's self-respect. Dignity is preserved when you stop offering your inner world to someone who hasn't handled it with care. Over-explaining often comes from a good place, the desire to be fair, transparent, and understood. But when transparency isn't met with consideration, it can begin to feel like self-betrayal. Silence draws a line that says, "Without hostility or blame, I will not keep exposing myself to indifference." There's also a subtle power in restraint. When you hold back from explaining, you resist the urge to defend your worth. You're no longer asking someone to see your value, you're assuming it. That assumption shifts how you carry yourself. Your energy becomes steadier, less reactive. You're not shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's limited capacity for empathy. Saying nothing also protects you from the emotional aftermath of being dismissed. When you explain and your words are minimized or misunderstood, the pain often deepens. Silence prevents that secondary wound. It allows you to disengage before your vulnerability is mishandled, preserving your sense of self rather than eroding it in pursuit of acknowledgement. This doesn't mean you become cold or closed off. It means you become selective. You choose where your honesty belongs. Dignity isn't about silence everywhere. It's about discernment. You learn to recognize when a conversation would lead to growth and when it would only cost you energy. In that awareness, silence becomes a form of wisdom rather than suppression. As you practice this restraint, you may notice a shift in how you relate to yourself. You start to feel less desperate to be understood and more comfortable being clear internally. You don't need to narrate your feelings to validate them. You trust yourself enough to act on what you know, even if no one else fully understands your reasons. For someone who expected access to your emotions, this change can be striking. The absence of explanation removes their ability to redefine or dismiss your experience. Your dignity is no longer something they get to interpret. It stands on its own, quiet and intact. Protecting your dignity through silence is about choosing self-respect over self-justification. It's the decision to stop translating your needs into language that someone else is unwilling to honor. And in that decision, you don't lose your voice. You reserve it for places where it will be valued. It's tempting to believe that the ultimate payoff of silence is the moment someone finally realizes what they lost. The mind imagines regret or a heartfelt return that validates everything you felt but couldn't make them see. Yet when your sense of resolution depends on another person's realization, you remain emotionally tied to their awareness. Silence, at its highest purpose, isn't about provoking insight in someone else. It's about creating peace within yourself. When you stop speaking and reacting, you begin to notice how much energy was spent managing someone else's understanding. You were monitoring their responses, adjusting your tone, and hoping your words would land in a way that changed things. Letting go of that effort is liberating. Your nervous system settles because you're no longer bracing for disappointment or waiting for acknowledgement. Peace comes quietly. It shows up as mental stillness, a space in your thoughts that used to be filled with analysis and anticipation. You stop replaying conversations and imagining alternative outcomes. Instead, your attention returns to your own life, your routines, your interests, your sense of direction. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but with each day of choosing silence over engagement, your inner world becomes steadier. What's important to understand is that peace doesn't require agreement or closure. It doesn't need someone else to admit fault or express remorse. It comes from accepting that you don't need to be understood by everyone to move forward. When you release the need for validation, you reclaim your autonomy. You stop handing over your emotional state to someone else's behavior. This is often when the other person's ego begins to react. Not because you intended it, but because your energy has changed. You're no longer available in the same way. There's no emotional tether to pull on. That absence can trigger reflection, but whether it does or doesn't is no longer your concern. Your peace isn't conditional on their growth. Choosing peace also means accepting uncertainty. You may never know what they thought, felt, or concluded, and that's okay. Peace doesn't come from answers, it comes from alignment. You know why you chose silence. You know what you needed. That self-knowledge is enough. As you settle into this calm, your standards naturally rise. You become less willing to engage in dynamics that require constant explanation or emotional effort. You start valuing consistency, presence, and ease. Relationships feel less like puzzles to solve and more like places to rest. The quiet truth is that saying nothing doesn't leave you empty. It creates space. Space for clarity, for self-trust, and for a life that doesn't revolve around someone else's recognition. And in that space, you realize the real outcome was never about his ego at all. It was about your peace finally undisturbed. Saying nothing isn't about punishment. It's about choosing peace over everything. When you stop explaining, stop reacting, and stop chasing understanding, you reclaim your dignity and your calm. And in that silence, whether his ego responds or not no longer matters, because you've already given yourself what you were waiting to receive.